occupation. Following the two-month Budapest campaign, the Red Army captured the city February 13, 1945. The red flag was raised in the Hungarian capital. Moscow created a puppet government and established Soviet control on a country that allied with Germany during World War II. The Red dictatorship replaced the fascist regime in Hungary. This system, which remained in Hungary for 50 years, existed solely due to the support of the Red Army and the Soviet intelligence services.
Nem a Magyar Kommunista Párt vette át a hatalmat.
The Hungarian Communist Party never came to power. It had neither the possibility nor the support of the public. It did not have enough followers. Hungarian communists only gained 1.6% of the vote at the elections. Their power solely rested in the support of its guarantor, the Red Army, which had troops stationed in Hungary. The Communist Party came to power in Hungary due to their efforts. The Soviet Army forcefully removed the democratically elected authorities that we chose. Hungarian police were governed by Soviet soldiers. The Soviet interference was conducted through violent, terrorist methods. That's how we got the communist government.
Nagyon-nagyon rosszul viselték ezt a kommunista megszállást.
The establishment of the communist regime was very painful for Hungarians, who felt themselves humiliated because they lost their independence. Many people took up arms in order to fight against the communist regime. Before the events in 1956, the communist regime wiped out over 400,000 people accused of links with the armed resistance. Tens of thousands of people were exiled or jailed. Practically the entire Hungarian society dreamed of an end to the Soviet regime and the expulsion of the foreign invaders. Hungary, which was considered to be in the Soviet sphere of influence, underwent the establishment of a communist regime after the end of World War II. The communists conducted formal elections in 1949 and officially marked their coming to power. The process was supervised by Hungarian Communist Party leader Mátyás Rákosi. From that point on, the construction of a communist system in Hungary proceeded at a fast pace. Hungarian communism was similar to the Soviet Stalinist model. Rákosi, who considered himself Stalin's disciple, copied the great leader in everything. A single-party system was established in the country. Intelligence services persecuted members of the opposition. Freedom of speech was limited. The authorities began intensively implanting Russian language and culture. The government nationalized banks, factories, the transportation system. Agricultural reform was conducted, which, in essence, implied collectivization. The transformations led to a catastrophic decline in living conditions. The reforms strengthened the anti-communist sentiments which already existed in the Hungarian society. Hungary was on the brink of an uprising. Fight for freedom. On July 13, 1953, Hungarian Communist Chairman Mátyás Rákosi was summoned to the Kremlin. He was harshly criticized for the difficult economic situation in the country. Rákosi, an avid supporter of Stalin, lost his position as the leader of Hungary once Stalin died. The new Kremlin hosts were distrustful of him, believing that Hungary needed new leadership. Rákosi did preserve his post within the party, although Moscow deemed it unwise to keep him as the head of the republic. Upon the Kremlin's recommendation, the post of prime minister was given to 57-year-old Imre Nagy. Moscow removed Matyas Rákosi from the post and selected Imre Nagy instead of him. Why did it happen? Because the dictatorship imposed by Matyas Rákosi was so unpopular and so difficult for the Hungarian public to bear that Moscow felt it.
Rákosi Mátyás diktálta kormányzás annyira népszerűtlen lett, annyira.
It was clear that Hungary was not only on the way to stabilization, quite the contrary. The tensions were increasing. The people failed to adjust to communist society and politics. They openly tired of the regime. More than that, they hated it. That's why Moscow replaced Matyas Rákosi. Imre Nagy, a member of the Bolshevik Party since 1917, was an acceptable candidate for Moscow. He constantly occupied high positions in the Hungarian government after the establishment of the socialist regime, with the exception of 1949, when Nagy criticized the collectivization policy in Hungary. He was expelled from the party at the time, although he repented and was accepted back into the party and government. Rákosi's government released Imre Nagy from his position because he spoke against the forced collectivization and the creation of collective farms. Nagy was a good specialist in the agricultural field. That is why he was selected as the chairman of the government. He was Moscow's man, which was supposed to play an important role in providing the population with food. He spoke Russian, which was also important. He could just pick up the phone and speak Russian with the Kremlin.
De azért fontos volt, hogy moszkovita legyen, hogy oroszul tudjon, ugye az se volt mindegy, hogy tudjon kommunikálni.
After his appointment to the new post, Nagy immediately began his reforms to liberalize Hungary. He wanted to painlessly transform the Stalinist system created by Rákosi. He halted the forced collectivization process. He began freeing and amnestying political prisoners. Hungarian media were partly relieved of censorship. Imre Nagy tried not only to democratize, but to dismantle the socialist system. These processes were met with resistance from Matyas Rákosi and his followers, who still had significant influence in the ruling party and the government. The new course was, however, supported by most Hungarian intellectuals and students.
Még jobban összekovácsolta a szabad népek erőfeszítését.
Media began publishing articles criticizing the mistakes of the socialist system. Moscow reacted negatively to Imre Nagy's reforms and summoned the chairman to Moscow. At a council meeting of the Communist Party's Presidium, January 8, 1955, which Nagy was also attending, Nikita Khrushchev accused him of factionalism. 3 months later, the Kremlin ordered the Central Committee of the Hungarian Socialist Party to relieve Nagy from the post of chairman and once again expelled him from the party. Rákosi and Imre Nagy had serious disagreements and a struggle between them. The Soviet side supported Rákosi, with Moscow scared that Imre Nagy might reach far with his reforms. The changes that Nagy realized in the spring of 1955 were unacceptable for the Soviet leaders of the time.
Which was already too much for the Soviet leadership as well at the time. That happened in the spring of 1955. So Imre Nagy was then abducted. He was fired as prime minister. He was also eventually dismissed from the party, the Communist Party, which was the most terrible thing that could happen to a communist.
Nagy's resignation strengthened the discontent that the Hungarian society had towards the communist system. Representatives of the intelligentsia, students, and members of the Communist Party that supported Nagy demanded that his course be continued. population distributed banned and censored literature, including the revolutionary poetry of famous Hungarian poet Sándor Petőfi. Petőfi for the Hungarians is what Rustaveli is for Georgians, Shakespeare for Brits, and Pushkin for Russians. In Hungary, his name is linked not only with poetry, but with a struggle for freedom. Sándor Petőfi was one of the leaders of the Hungarian Revolution in 1848. The Young Hungary organization that he created was at the forefront of the revolution. The poet died in 1849 fighting for freedom. He was killed in a battle with Russian Cossacks. 100 years later, Petőfi's name inspired a new revolution. Now the Hungarians were protesting against Soviet occupation, with youth once again at the forefront. Students organized a Sándor Petőfi Appreciation Society in Budapest in 1955, which became the center of free debate in Hungary. The participants openly protested the Soviet regime during the meetings. The communists disbanded the society in the summer of 1956, although this did not bring the desired results. Several months later, the same youth that attended the Petőfi Society started a revolution in Hungary. The Petőfi Society was carefully watched by Moscow. Soviet ambassador to Hungary Yuri Andropov almost daily informed the Kremlin about the anti-Soviet meetings. From the secret report by Yuri Andropov. Several thousand people consisting of writers, journalists, newspaper editors, students, university teachers, and others, including many MDP members, gathered for the discussion. They mentioned speeches, including mainly speeches against the party government in general and its specific members in particular. There were speeches for the rehabilitation of Imre Nagy. Journalist Moczar said during his speech that Hungary has not seen freedom of speech for the last 108 years since Petőfi's death. Writers Taros and Kuczka provocatively claimed that the Hungarian people have been living in constant fear since 1945. According to reports from the comrades present at the said discussion, many of the above-mentioned speeches were greeted with applause and affirmative cries from the audience. The situation in Hungary continued spinning out of control. The communists tried to ease the tensions by reshuffling personnel. Matyas Rákosi was removed from the post of First Secretary of the Hungarian People's Party on July 17th. He was replaced by the chairman of the Governmental Economic Committee, Ernő Nagygere. It proved to be insufficient.
A nice replacement for Rákosi, but actually they replaced him with another Stalinist, another Orthodox, which was Ernő Gerő, who was the right-hand man of Rákosi in the earlier times. So he was exactly the same way responsible for the crimes as Rákosi himself. So this was a great, tragedy for the Hungarians, because they saw that the intentions of the Russians, which were so promising at the 20th Party Congress, are not necessarily real, because if they don't really give us a real good leader, still a communist leader.
2 months after Gere's appointment, the Hungarian Writers' Union openly expressed its support for Imre Nagy and demanded his rehabilitation. The communist leadership, still losing its influence in the country, is forced to restore his party membership, although even this step fails to stop the anti-communist movement. The first massive public gathering of an anti-communist nature is held October 6, 1956, around the reburial of the remains László Rajk, a Hungarian communist executed in 1949 under Rákosi's regime and rehabilitated after Stalin's death. More than 100,000 people participated in the march. It was then that the anti-Stalin slogans were first shouted on the streets of Budapest. Apparently, it was just the beginning. On October 16th, students of a university in Szegeda left the pro-communist Democratic Youth Organization and re-established the Union of Hungarian University and Academy Students. The union had clear anti-Soviet demands. All higher education institutions in Hungary soon joined the new student formation. A meeting was conducted in Budapest Technical University, October 22nd. The participating students prepared a 16-point manifesto. The main demands being the removal of Soviet troops from Hungary, free elections, the release of political prisoners, the restoration of national symbols and holidays, the abolishment of communist censorship, and the return of Imre Nagy as the head of state. At noon, October 22nd, we held a large meeting at the University of Budapest. Almost 600 students attended it. There, we presented our demands to the party and the government. These demands were listed as points, reaching 16, as you know. We were discussing them when Joseph Szilágyi, Imre Nagy's close associate, came in and said, "Do you know what's happening in Warsaw just as you're sitting here arguing and preparing demands?" We asked him about what was going on. He said there were unrests and anti-Soviet demonstrations. It was noon on the 22nd. We decided to pay homage to the old Hungarian-Polish friendship and show solidarity with Poland and the Polish people. In solidarity, we decided to go to the monument of General Joseph Bem, who was a hero for both nations. The revolution did not start on October 23rd because someone planned it so. The events started developing in such a way that people had had enough and the situation turned into a revolution. People felt the pressure of the dictatorship and they did not like it. They did not like it regardless of whether they openly voiced their protest or were scared to raise their heads. Pressure was exerted on the people's conscience, and when the state of things became unbearable, it was no longer possible to tolerate it. A revolution happened. The idea of the revolution was that it was not premeditated, it was not organized in advance, and it was not managed by anyone. Downtown Budapest was flooded with people by 2 p.m., October 23rd. The demonstrators marched towards the monument of Joseph Bem, one of the leaders of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848. The number of demonstrators grew as the march proceeded, and civilians joined the protesters along the way. When the rally began on October 23rd and the students took their cause to the streets, they were joined by thousands of people, and it became obvious that everyone was sick of the life they'd been forced to live at that point. The fear evaporated in a second, and when fear disappears, there is nothing that can stop the drive of people yearning for freedom. By 3 p.m., 200,000 people had gathered by the Bem Monument. The protesters were removing Soviet symbols from Hungarian flags and were shouting anti-Soviet slogans. People began moving from the Bem Monument towards the parliament. Some of the students marched towards the state radio building. The demonstrations turned into an armed confrontation right here, near the Radio Budapest building. Some students reached it by 6 p.m. They requested a live broadcast in order to read their 16-point demands. The building was already protected by the reinforced Hungarian security forces by that time. Representatives of the student delegation were allowed inside the building for negotiations with the management of the radio. They never came back. By 9 p.m., the crowd at the radio building had grown by the thousands, and they were showered by tear gas grenades from the windows above. A few minutes later, security forces opened fire against the unarmed civilians. Security guards started throwing tear gas grenades at us from the building's windows. We know that the tear gas grenades had 8 seconds to explode. So we collected them and threw them back inside the windows. We saw smoke emerge from inside the building. The security guards disappeared after that. Some time later, soldiers received orders to open fire and began shooting. Many were wounded. Many were killed. They were lying right there on the ground. The demonstrators managed to disarm the security guards along the perimeter of the building and began storming the station. People from all over the city came to their aid. A real battlefield unraveled in the front of the radio building. The first Soviet tanks summoned to suppress the anti-Soviet demonstrations appeared on the streets in Budapest at 2 a.m. in the morning. At a council meeting with the members of the Presidium of the Communist Party's Central Committee, Nikita Khrushchev decides to send troops into the Hungarian capital. Upon the order of the Soviet Union's defense minister, Marshal Zhukov, a special corps of the Soviet army stationed in Hungary is entrusted with the task of suppressing the demonstrations. Soviet troops entered Budapest right after the revolution began. The revolution overthrew the communist system and destroyed the Soviet model of dictatorship. The Soviet tanks were sent to protect it because the communist system was unable to defend itself. The people hated and detested it. It resisted change so much that the people rebelled and made a revolution.
Maga a kommunista kormányzás nem tudta önmagát fenntartani.
In order to ease the tensions, an emergency meeting of the Central Committee of Hungary's People's Party decided to return Imre Nagy as the Prime Minister. This move had no impact on the people protesting in the streets. The arrival of Soviet troops on the streets of Budapest led to an increase in patriotic sentiments. The Soviet officers tried to help Hungarian security forces surrounded inside the radio building, but were met with fierce resistance and had to withdraw. We went to the radio. We wanted to announce the 16 points. There were a lot of people around the building. The clashes had not yet begun by that time. There were a lot of ambulances near the building. They were driving at such a frequency that the people began to suspect something. The protesters stopped one of the cars and discovered that it was transporting officers from Hungary's security forces. They were wearing security uniforms under their white doctor's coats. Through the back doors, they were bringing in weapons to the building. People got a hold of the weapons and a real siege of the building began. I stayed on the roof of a building across the road for some time. There were young men armed with guns confiscated from the ambulance. They said I had to reload the weapons during the shooting, so I reloaded their guns, one by one.
Na most egy idő után én fönt voltam a rádióval szemben a háztetőn, 2 fiú volt ott, és nekik már akkor volt géppisztolyuk.
By the morning of October 24th, the building of the radio station was fully under the demonstrators' control. Along with this building, the protesters also captured the Hungarian army base and took their weapons. By 2 p.m., October 24th, the Soviet troops had regained control over the buildings of the parliament, the Central Committee, the airport, and the railway station. Almost all residents of Budapest joined the resistance movement. Unarmed civilians protested by destroying communist symbols. They chiseled the Soviet coat of arms off the roofs of administrative buildings, burnt red flags, and threw Lenin's works into the fire. Out of all the Soviet symbols, the first thing that the people protesting in the streets of Budapest destroyed was Stalin's statue. Leader, teacher, and the best friend of the Hungarian people. This was the writing on the monument to Joseph Stalin, standing right here in the center of Budapest. This site now hosts a memorial for those who died during the 1956 uprising. The monument in honor of the Soviet leader was erected in Budapest on December 21st, 1951. On Stalin's birthday. The bronze statue, created by Hungarian sculptor Mikusz, was a gift from the Hungarian people for Stalin's 70th Jubilee. The statue and its foundation reached a height of 25 meters. One of the main targets for the people who took to the streets in their protest against the communist regime turned out to be Joseph Stalin. The protesters brought a ladder to the dictator's statue, wrapped his bronze head in ropes, and began demolishing it. The great leader was first deprived of his head, then the rest of his body. In the end, all that remained of Stalin on the pedestal was his bronze boots. Students adorned Stalin's boots with the Hungarian national flag. They wrote insults on the statue's head and threw it in the central square of the city. At 3 p.m. October 24th, Imre Nagy appeals to the population by radio and asked everyone to stay calm. He promises that no harsh measures would be applied to the protesters if they laid down their arms. Despite the immense respect for the Prime Minister, no Hungarian abandoned the armed struggle. Several thousand soldiers and officers from the Hungarian National Army defected to the side of the protesters. The demonstrators thus gained access to heavy weapons. A real battle began in Budapest. The Hungarians fired at Soviet soldiers from the roofs and attics of multi-story buildings, erected barricades, and closed off streets. We lived on the second floor, and our windows looked out at the street. We saw the tanks passing one by one. Suddenly, one of the tanks stopped, turned its muzzle towards a building across from ours, and fired. A huge hole emerged in the building across. Then the tank turned towards our building. I grabbed my father by the shoulder and said, "Let's run. They're going to shoot us." We could only take about 5 steps before we were covered by the wave of the explosion. It was a terrible sound. The Soviet military leadership redeployed a mechanized division stationed in Romania to Budapest October 25th to fight the rebellion. Several hours later, after the battle had begun, the division lost over 100 officers. This rebellion helped the Hungarians preserve their self-respect. It was a fight for freedom.
majd egy ilyen elrettentő.
When the Soviet tanks entered Budapest, they thought it would be the same as in 1953 in Berlin, where they succeeded in scaring the population. They thought it would be the same here.
És ez ellenkező. Ebben lehet, hogy
They thought the Hungarians would get scared and get back to their homes.
Ebben az esetben.
They thought they'd introduce martial law and it would all end peacefully.
Tankokkal. Most azt kell tudni, hogy ezek a tankok a második világháborúból még akkor is.
It happened the other way in reality. The Hungarians confronted the tanks.
Megfordulni.
The Soviet Union sends a mechanized division to the Hungarian capital in order to suppress the people's rebellion. The division consists of about 6,000 troops, up to 400 armored units, and 156 artillery pieces. Around 3,000 Hungarians fight them. The biggest part of the rebels consists of workers, students, and ordinary civilians. There are also professional officers who switched from the army side to the side of the rebellion. Their tactics were defined by the available weapons. The rebels fought the Soviet troops in small groups. They were mainly equipped with machine guns, grenades, and Molotov cocktails. The Soviet tank operators, who did not know the city well and found it difficult to maneuver the tanks down narrow streets, were easy targets for the Hungarian fighters. The Hungarians fired at the Soviet vehicles and the soldiers from all directions. In 6 days of warfare, the Soviet division lost over 60 tanks and about 4,000 soldiers. There was not only shooting in Budapest, but hand-to-hand fighting as well. The tanks were bombarded with Molotov cocktails. They would use ordinary beer or wine bottles, or milk bottles, filled them with gasoline and threw them on the tanks from the upper floors of the buildings. The gas broke and the liquid poured onto the motor and the tank burned. The soldiers inside the machines either died on the spot or jumped out of the hatchets trying to save themselves.
Az üveg, a flaskó eltört, a folyadék ráfolyt a motorházra. Hát egy tanknak a motorháza az egy forró acéltömb.
October 25th, the Kremlin relieves Emre Geri from the post of First Secretary and appoints Politburo member Janusz Kadar instead. At the same time, in order to resolve the crisis, Imre Nagy begins negotiations with the members of the workers' delegations who supported the rebels. During the meetings, he fully understands that unless the conditions of the rebellion are accepted, the street fighting would continue. October 27th, Nagy holds negotiations with Suslov and Mikoyan. He explains to the Kremlin representatives that a partial satisfaction of the demands will not endanger socialism in Hungary. He asks that the Soviet troops be removed from Budapest to ease tensions. Soviet Politburo members Mikoyan and Suslov came here to Hungary 3 to 4 times to meet with Imre Nagy. They more or less agreed with Nagy, especially Mikoyan. Mikoyan, for example, said to Nagy, "Dear comrade, act as you see fit." Imre Nagy answered that the Hungarian people want the Soviet troops out of Hungary, that Hungary wants to be a neutral country, no longer part of the Warsaw Pact. They showed understanding to the wishes of the Hungarians and returned to Moscow with such sentiments. That's why we thought the situation was not so desperate. October 28th. At a meeting of the Central Committee in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev orders a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Hungary. Moscow studies the situation and awaits further developments. The Soviet Union needs time to mobilize the troops, as it had become obviously impossible to suppress the Hungarian rebellion with the available forces. It was a consolidation of all the forces. The Soviet leadership, the Soviet government, and first of all the Soviet command stationed here saw that they lost the battle. It came as a great surprise to them. After lengthy negotiations and meetings,
csődbe ment.
Moscow decided that the troops had to leave from Budapest. The Soviet army departed from the city, defeated.
Hosszadalmas tárgyalások nyomán Moszkvába elhatározták, hogy kivonulnak Budapestről.
Soviet troops began withdrawing from Budapest on October 29th. Only a few units were left behind to guard the Soviet embassy and the Hungarian Interior Ministry building. Street fighting in Budapest had stopped, although the situation remained tense. The rebels demanded that the government remove Soviet troops from all Hungarian territory and that the country leave the Warsaw Pact and announce neutrality. Imre Nagy gave his word that he would begin negotiations with the Kremlin about a full-scale withdrawal of Soviet troops. There were 5 or 6 Soviet tanks and various armored vehicles on the streets. There were soldiers on top of the tanks who told us, "Go home." I told them, "You go home yourselves. We're at home here. It's you who is not at home." Sometimes these verbal exchanges were calm. Sometimes we raised our voices. One Soviet soldier told us, "We're here to protect you." I told him, "We don't need protection. Everything's fine with us." The uprising happened because there are Soviet troops in our country. But this Soviet soldier stubbornly kept repeating that they were here to protect Hungarian workers from landowners, bankers, and barons. I was a manual laborer at the time. I showed him my hands and said, "Look, we're workers ourselves. Do you see barons or capitalists anywhere?"
Titeket, a magyar dolgozókat, és erre én magam, mutattam a kezemet. Én munkás ember voltam akkor, tehát a kezemen látszott a munkás, a fizikai munka nyoma. Nézz ide, mondtam, hogy hát mi dolgozunk, mi vagyunk a munkások. Hol vannak itt a bárók meg a kapitalisták?
October 30th, Imre Nagy abolishes the single-party system and announces the creation of a coalition government. These developments, along with the danger of Hungary quitting the Warsaw Pact, causes a stiff rebuke from Moscow. It was obvious that the Soviet Union would not grant anyone the right to hold free elections. They would not allow the Red Army to leave Hungarian territory. They considered the 1956 revolution a deadly blow to the Soviet system and Soviet ideology.
Ugyanakkor ez az 56-os forradalom, ez egy halálos sebet ejtett a szovjet rendszeren, az egész kommunista ideológián.
The events of October 30th were amplified by the Suez Crisis in the Middle East. Israel, France, and Great Britain carried out a military intervention against Egypt, considered a friendly state by the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, who always sharply reacted to a disruption of the balance of power on the international arena, toughened his position on Hungary. Do not remove troops from Hungary and Budapest, and take the initiative to restore order in Hungary. Our withdrawal from Hungary will encourage the American, British, and French imperialists. They will see our weakness and begin the attack. We will reveal this weakness of our positions, but our party will not understand this. We will turn Hungary as well as Egypt over to them. We have no other choice. October 31st, an emergency meeting of the Communist Party Central Committee Politburo is held in Moscow, during which Khrushchev demands that the new workers' and peasants' government be created in Hungary under the leadership of János Kádár. The Kremlin assigned the task of suppressing the Budapest uprising to Marshal Ivan Konev. November 1st, Imre Nagy is informed that new Soviet army units have entered Hungary. The Prime Minister demands explanations from Soviet Ambassador Yuri Andropov and receives an extremely vague answer. He convenes a government meeting, during which he puts the question of Hungary quitting the Warsaw Pact up for a vote. The decision is unanimously supported. Soviet troops encircle Budapest on November 1st. The command spreads the contents of an emergency decree among officers. Here's how the soldiers were explained the necessity to conduct a military operation. At the end of October, the reactionary and counter-revolutionary forces in our brotherly Hungary raised an uprising to destroy the People's Democratic Order, to obliterate the revolutionary victories of the workers, and to restore landowning capitalist rules. The task of the Soviet troops is to help the brotherly Hungarian nation protect its socialist conquests, to demolish the counter-revolution, and to liquidate all threats of the reemergence of fascism.
És kérem szépen,
At 3 in the morning, there was such noise as if the earth exploded. It was the sound of hundreds of tanks moving.
a föld megnyílt volna, mert itt ugye jött.
I had a small child and my wife was pregnant. I was worried about them. I didn't know what would happen.
A Forradalmi Bizottság közül ugye
Everyone ran here and there, trying to save themselves. I remained alone.
nem kell mondani, tudja, ugye terhes.
The majority of the city was surrounded. I went towards the Russian army headquarters. I know that their headquarters was located near the railway station.
És elmenekültek.
The bombing started as soon as I went outside.
A város
The first shell hit a house where we were conferring half an hour ago. November 4th, 1956, at 5:30 in the morning, the Soviet military command begins Operation Whirlwind with the aim of gaining full control over Budapest. The operation involves up to 6,000 soldiers, 6,000 armored units, artillery, and air support. Despite the overwhelming superiority of the Soviet army, residents of Budapest selflessly resist the occupiers. Hungarians fight with particular resistance in front of the Parliament building, the King's Palace, Moscow Square, and Mount Gellert. It was especially difficult for the Soviet troops to recuperate this cinema, Corvin, which hosted the headquarters of the Hungarians. For several days, 5 Soviet battalions assaulted the building, which was guarded with only 359 people. Up to 170 artillery guns from 20 tanks and 11 artillery divisions fired at the cinema. The Soviet troops managed to capture the rebel headquarters only on November 7th at 4 in the morning. The main resistance of the Hungarians was overcome, although local battles continued inside the city. Soviet troops finally destroyed the last center of resistance, situated in the Szepel district, on November 9th, using air raids and artillery. We were not seriously armed. There were just a couple of tanks, light weapons, and Molotov cocktails. That's it. We could only resist the massive Soviet army for a few hours, a day at most. But we were determined to fight, and the whole world sympathized with us. But that was it. The big powers didn't even say anything in our defense. The U.S. only sent their best regards and aided us with warm blankets. But President Eisenhower did not say a word about us on the international arena. That's how it was. But we, having felt the sweet taste of freedom 2 weeks before, did not want to admit to ourselves that it was all over.
Nem akartunk beletörődni abba, hogy most már mindennek vége.
Other Hungarian cities fought against the Red Army besides Budapest. The Soviet troops were shown resistance in Győr, Miskolc, Pécs, Debrecen, and Békéscsaba. Despite the nationwide protests, the public anti-communist uprising ended in failure. They say they hanged 280 people. Tens of thousands of corpses drifted in the Danube River in those days. The bodies were picked in the streets, loaded onto trucks, and thrown into the river. We were prohibited from remembering it for 40 years. Should anyone speak about it, he would be fired, and his wife and children sent to camps. November 7th, the new chairman of the Workers' and Peasants' Government, Janusz Kadar, who is in Moscow since November 2nd, enters Budapest under the protection of Soviet tanks. His first order is to restore the state administration that was in force in Hungary before the uprising. Right after the Soviet intervention begins, Imre Nagy and a number of government ministers hide in the Yugoslavian embassy. He is hoping that the West will exert pressure upon Moscow, but he was wrong. The Soviet side tricked Imre Nagy out of the embassy and detained him. The Soviet side lost over 700 soldiers, and more than 1,500 were wounded during Operation Whirlwind. Around 3,000 Hungarians died, and an immense number of civilians were wounded. Bombardments and street fights left most of the city in ruins. During the uprising, Budapest suffered more than during the war. The worst destruction hit the city after the November 4th military operation began. Everything was in ruins. Houses were destroyed, flats resembled a theater stage. You could see everything inside the apartments because the walls were knocked down. They did terrible things. The suppression of the Hungarian uprising was followed by large-scale repressions. Soviet State Security Committee Chairman Ivan Serov organizes the arrests. The repressions affected members of the resistance movement, representatives of the revolutionary councils, intellectuals, and opposition parties. The Hungarian communist authorities arrested over 15,000 people after suppressing the 1956 uprising. The majority of them were kept behind bars in Budapest's prison on Kozma Street. Hungary's first instance court sentenced 280 people to death. This is where the death row inmates were kept. It has around 20 cells. Each cell contained 2 to 4 prisoners. They spent months here waiting for the final verdict. When the second instance court began reviewing the file, the prisoner was transferred to the death row cells at the back of the building. The first instance court sentenced me to death. 3.5 months later, the judge of the second instance court did not change the sentence and read the final verdict. I did not feel anything after the sentence was read. I was even laughing to myself, saying, "You idiots, I'm not guilty of anything. I did nothing wrong." I had no idea why I was sentenced to death, but an hour later, I was in the death row cell. The prisoners waited for the decision of the second instance court in these cells. Should the death sentence remain in force, the fate of the prisoner was decided. The execution would begin at 6 a.m. 4 guards escorted the prisoner. A special commission, with its chairman sitting at this table, would read the final death verdict to the prisoner. The black curtains were then pushed aside, and the guards dragged the half-unconscious prisoner towards the gallows. The executioner waited for him here and put the loop over his head after he ascended to the stairs. When the guards pushed the chair from under his feet, the executioner broke his spine. This is how they killed 270 people here from 1956 to 1960.
აი ასეთი მეთოდით 1956-დან 1960-მდე აქ 261 ადამიანი მოკლეს.
They hanged people every day here. On rare occasions, they only executed one person per day. Generally, they killed 3 to 4 people. Once, they hanged 11 people in one day. 11 people killed in a single day. When I was brought here into the death row cell, I could not think about anything anymore. There was emptiness. I tried to distract myself, but it did not work. The only thing you could speak about here was the fact you were still alive. I remember when they took me out of the cell, this tiny space was crowded with 16 people. I don't know who they were. A judge, a prosecutor, the person who wrote the protocol, a doctor, they were all sitting there. The others were over there. I stood here. 2 men were holding me by the arms, like this, from behind. I don't remember how they told me that the second instance court transferred my file to the chairman of the government and that I was pardoned. It was a very rare thing to happen. I think it was 7 of us who were pardoned. All the others were hanged. The hangman's helpers were holding me over there. The executioner stood behind me. God forgive me, but I got the impression that this hangman was a decent man. Hungarians tried to flee abroad to get away from the political terror. The rebels and their families fled to Austria and Yugoslavia. "200,000 people left their country after the uprising was suppressed, about 5% of the population. The Austrian government was obliged to open a refugee camp on its territory to accommodate the massive inflow of refugees. At the border, a huge part of the Hungarian intelligentsia and athletes appear. The Hungarian Olympic team refuses to compete under the flag of the Hungarian People's Republic. The majority of the athletes refused to return home. A closed process begins in Hungary's National Court on June 9, 1958, which tries former Prime Minister Imre Nagy and a number of his associates. They are accused of treason and organizing a coup. Imre Nagy was sentenced to death on June 15th. He was executed the next day. Hungary's freedom was postponed for another 40 years.
The Hungarian Revolution was defeated basically because of the international situation, because of the Cold War context. This Cold War context meant that the status quo, which was established in Europe in 1945, was recognized by both sides. What was on the east belonged to the Soviet Empire, what was on to the west belonged to Western Europe and to the United States Empire. This was a very exact rule which was working throughout the whole Cold War up until the very end. That meant that whatever happened in the East Bloc, notwithstanding any kind of propaganda on the Western side, the West always knew that they would do nothing and they could do nothing because they had no chance and they had no right to intervene in the internal affairs of the Soviet Empire. This was meant to be a kind of internal issue. Of course, in their propaganda, they said an exactly different thing. They said, of course, they are very much for the Hungarians and the Soviets are doing a terrible thing, whatever. But on the level of realpolitik, they always accepted this.
First of all, we should admit, and I've said already, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century.